Some of the language is so stark and, in a sense, so provocative, it encapsulates his disdain for the rules-based international order.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
The deepening ties between China, Russia and North Korea would certainly have some in Washington concerned.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
I'm Roland Oliphant and this is Battle Lines. It's Monday, the 8th of December, 2025. Just before we all packed up for the weekend on Friday evening, Donald Trump's White House published a remarkable document. It was his national security strategy, something that all presidents traditionally publish to set out their administration's goals and priorities on the world stage. But this one, it's fair to say, is unlike any such document seen, well, probably for the past several decades. The difference is partly in how it describes America's traditional enemies. Russia is described simply as another power with which to seek strategic balance. That is the rationale for ending the war in Ukraine, apparently. China is described, certainly in terms one would reserve for a global rival. But in the Middle East and Africa, America has apparently only one priority. That is doing business. The era of intervention is over, and so is the era of telling other governments how to run their countries. The document's real ire is reserved for Europe. According to Donald Trump's administration, set down here in black and white on the official document dictating the priorities of this administration's foreign policy, Europe is described as facing civilisational erasure. The issues facing it include the European Union, transnational bodies, it says, that undermine political liberty and sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech and suppression of political opposition, cratering birth rates, the loss of national identities and self-confidence. Should these trends continue, the Americans believe the continent will be, quote, unrecognizable in 20 years or less. It's far from obvious whether certain European countries will have economies and militaries strong enough to remain reliable allies, and the list goes on. It's caused shockwaves on this side of the Atlantic, quite understandably. To unpack all this, I'm turning to someone who has personal experience of how tricky it can be navigating the transatlantic relationship with Donald Trump. Kim Darroch was the British ambassador in Washington until he was finally kicked out effectively when Donald Trump found out he'd written an unflattering email about him. It was an unfortunate end to a long and glittering diplomatic career, but one that gave him a perhaps unique insight into the Trumpian worldview that's laid out in the document published on Friday. I began by asking him about his own diplomatic career and how he ended up in Washington.
I was 43 years in the British diplomatic service, and I specialized on two areas, really. On Europe, I spent 15 years on policy and negotiating on European Union issues, culminating as Tony Blair's EU advisor and ambassador to the European Union from 2007 to 2012, and national security. And I was national security advisor for David Cameron from 2012 to 2015, and then finished my career as British ambassador in Washington, where I served from basically the beginning of 2016 to middle of 2019. So the last year of Obama and the first 2.5 years of Donald Trump.
One of the things we want to ask from you is, would you have expected this from the first Trump administration? But first of all, I'm just to throw this document at you. I mean, it's been thrown at all of us, really. We kind of saw it on Friday afternoon, leafed through it and thought, my God, what is this? And I think everyone spent the weekend trying to getting their heads around it, and everyone has an opinion. What did you make of this new national security strategy when you saw it?
Look, it's an extraordinary document, Roland. It is extraordinary, and it could be summarized in a sentence as essentially a repudiation of 7 decades of US foreign policy. So different is it from the traditional American appreciation of their national security objectives. That said, I can't say that it was a huge surprise to me, although some of the language is so stark and, in a sense, so provocative that goes further than I might have expected. But it's very, very Donald Trump. It really is. These are views that he has held for decades, in broad terms. Look, his people in his first term said this is a guy who reads somewhere between very little and nothing. And so I can't quite believe he himself has read all 33 pages of this text. But it really does crystallize his view of the world. It encapsulates his sort of disdain for the rules-based international order, his many criticisms of Europe, what I think is a preference for a view that the world should be organized more around power than around rules, and that in that context, the key players are the United States as the dominant superpower and China and Russia. And it's very, very striking that the document is almost silent on Russia. And as far as China is concerned, there is a reference to Taiwan, but basically China is seen primarily as an economic challenge. And most of all, it's about a world which is divided into old-fashioned spheres of influence. And the primary emphasis in this document is about America's interests in the Western Hemisphere and in Latin America. And there are things in it with which, one would agree, but it is an extraordinary shift from traditional American foreign policy and national security objective.
In your view, this is as extraordinary as people have been saying. It's not something to brush under the carpet then.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it's also things that Trump has believed in for decades and that he's been saying ever since he's been in the Oval Office in one way or another, including in his first term.
You were an ambassador in Washington during the first Trump administration, so you're used to dealing with him. But one thing that people have suggested that this is less Donald Trump than J.D. Vance. But you seem to think this is a very Trumpian. This is Donald.
I don't think he will have sort of dictated or pored over every line in it. And there are certainly bits in it that sound to me very J.D. Vance. There is, for example, a reference in it to the restoration and reinvigoration of American spiritual and cultural health, and the need for, can you believe it, a national security document, for growing numbers of strong traditional families in America. And that echoes some stuff that J.D. Vance has been saying recently, and it really isn't very much the sort of thing that Donald Trump talks about a lot. So there is quite a lot of Vance in it. And then there are also bits in it, I think, Roland, that Steve Bannon wasn't after the first 8 months of Trump won. He's no longer in the Trump administration. He's not employed by Donald Trump, but he's a very strong voice in the whole MAGA movement, and I think still influential. And so there are passages in this that are basically about America encouraging and supporting what they call the patriotic political parties in Europe. But those are, let's be straight, those are the populist or far right, depending on your viewpoint, parties in Europe. And one of Steve Bannon's roles in the first term, for the time he was in the White House, was acting as the channel to all of those parties. So you would get people from Alternative for Deutschland and the National Rally and the populist parties in Hungary and Italy coming in through the back door of the White House while European leaders were coming through the front door. So there's quite a lot of Steve Bannon in all that stuff about we must encourage these populist parties in Europe to replace some of the minority and very unstable mainstream parties that are there. So, it pulls together quite a lot of threads in the MAGA universe.
The most controversial thing, it seems to me, what's really ruffled feathers, or at least in this part of the world, is what it says about Europe. It seems to me, we can get onto China and the Middle East and Africa. Some parts of that, it seems to me, are fairly orthodox. But it really seems a fundamentally anti-European document. I'm just going to read out the passage that I think has really ruffled feathers on this side of the Atlantic, which says, the Trump administration finds itself at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations for the war, it's the war in Ukraine, perched in unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition. A large European majority wants peace, yet that desire is not translated into policy in large measure because of those governments' subversion of democratic processes. He seems to be saying any European government that has raised objections to the American vision of peace in Ukraine is democratically illegitimate. It's an extraordinary kind of attack. What should European governments take away from that? Or what should the British government take away from that?
First of all, this I don't think necessarily represents the views of the entire American national security community, not even the views of all those working in the Trump administration. I mean, I'm not sure that this is really where Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, is, for example. Second, it's a cry of frustration about this administration's failure so far to achieve a ceasefire, let alone a peace deal, in Ukraine. But let's remember, the Europeans, and indeed Ukraine itself, haven't forced their views on the US. They have spent many hours on 2 or 3 occasions when the direction of the Trump administration appears to be far too pro-Russian, talking to delegations often led by Marco Rubio, and persuading him to shift the American proposals a bit back towards a more balanced proposition. So the 28-point Trump peace plan becomes a sort of 19-point plan that's much more balanced. Now, there are people inside the US administration who agree with that, otherwise it wouldn't have been changed. That's language you quoted about Ukraine, I think, is a cry of frustration from part of the Trump administration about the way that American proposals have been changed by the Europeans and indeed by the intervention of Ukraine. And I have to say, that's a sort of recognition, if you like, that Europe has still had some influence over what has happened. I remember a senior US military figure a few months ago telling a little group of us why Trump appears to be so positive about Putin. And of course, there are lots of theories about Russian oligarchs having bailed out Trump's businesses at points in their career, or other links between Trump and Putin, or indeed about how Trump admires Putin as a sort of model strongman on the current global scene. But this guy, this person who's worked with Trump a lot, said to us, the way Trump looks at the world is he looks at Russia and sees that it has 45% of the world's nuclear weapons, that it is the world's largest supplier of natural gas, that it's the 3rd biggest producer of oil, and that it has something like 10% of the world's rare earth resources, though it only produces less than 1% of the marketed rare earths around the world because they are so poor at extraction and processing. And Trump's big idea with Russia is an economic relationship, a big trade deal, which gets American companies into exploiting Russia's rare earths, getting involved in their energy production, and generally stabilizing the relationship with Russia with a big economic element as part of it. And that's just very much the Trump businessman. He sees China in the same way, largest economic challenge. So Ukraine for him is a very secondary issue, and it's this big obstacle on the road he wants to travel down. It's blocking him getting to where he wants to get with Russia, so he's hugely frustrated about it. Hence, no surprise that Donald Trump Jr. said in the last 24 hours that Trump may just walk away from the whole Ukraine issue and just do what he wants to do with Russia, without bothering to try and find a peace deal there, just because it's become so blocked and so intractable.
On that note, there's something of an emergency summit happening in Downing Street today. Keir Starmer's receiving Vladimir Zelensky. Friedrich Merz, I believe Macron is coming along. It's being billed as just a catch-up on Ukraine's strategy, but it sounds much more like a kind of, what on earth are we going to do now? What do you think they'll be discussing, and what would you advise them in terms of response to this kind of thing?
Let's not give up on the sort of Trump peace initiative, and let's hope that at some point in the future, Putin is prepared to make some concessions, because that's essential to getting the Ukrainians on board for a ceasefire, let alone a peace deal. But I'm very pessimistic about it, but it's not a 0% possibility. But let's assume, I hope the two leaders will think about the worst case scenario, which is this, which is Trump loses patience with the whole Ukraine thing, and as his son has just suggested, walks away from it. And in walking away from it, he also says, because 60% of Republican voters want this, I'm going to stop US military supplies to Ukraine. Now, Ukrainians already very much on the defensive in that war. They're doing okay in terms of holding the Russians back, but they are increasingly threatened, I think, by Russia's manpower superiority and by the fact they just don't in themselves have enough men, and desertions at an all-time high. So they're under real pressure. And if America walks away and stops supplying them with some of the high-tech gear in particular they've been giving them, then that pressure will increase a lot. And so the question for Europe is, if America does just walk away from it and say, over to you, Europe, it's your problem, to what extent are we able to step up the support we're giving to Ukraine and to backfill for all the stuff that they will no longer be getting from the United States? Are we just going to buy stuff from the United States, then give it to Ukraine? And are European economies up to that? And, are we in a short enough time going to be able to produce enough of our own equipment, both to replenish our own stocks, because certainly in the UK they're very low now because of all the stuff we've given to Ukraine, and actually supply Ukraine with what it needs? Because if we can't do that, then I think the risk of a Russian victory in Ukraine becomes significantly bigger.
I just want to read to you some of it seems like such a profound shift in the transatlantic relationship. So here's just a few of the things that have appeared just basically on my Twitter feed over the past hour or so. There's an article on futurenavy.com saying the US national security strategy leaves no ambiguity. Europe must generate its own deterrent mass in the North Atlantic and surrounding seas. Then you have Giorgia Meloni, who was on Italian television on Friday evening after this came out, saying Europe must develop autonomous defense to become a true global power and achieve independence from the US. And then there's an article in Foreign Affairs, I believe, arguing that what stands in the way of Europe's ability to provide its own security is a lack of German nuclear forces. Oh. This is extraordinary stuff. This is where the conversation's going. Is that the juncture in history we're at now?
It sort of is, I think. To be fair to what's happening and what has been written across the Atlantic, make a couple of points. First of all, Europe has been lunching for free at American expense for 5 decades because our spending collectively in Europe on defense has been pathetic, and we have relied on America basically defending us. We should have been doing this years ago, decades ago. Second, if you go into the fine print of this national security strategy, there is a recognition that the language is something like, we cannot afford to write Europe off. Doing so would be self-defeating for what this strategy aims to achieve. Our goal instead should be to help Europe correct its current trajectory. So, that's a bit grudging, but even so, there is still some recognition there that Europe matters strategically to the US. All that said, where we are now, we just are going to have to spend a huge amount more. 3.5% by 2035 is the target, at a time when European economies are very weak, and that's a huge challenge.
Do you think Germany should go nuclear?
I don't think that. I don't think that this is not a prospect that personally terrifies me, but if I lived in Poland, I might think differently. It's enough for the UK and France to have nuclear deterrence, provided we keep them. But I do think that a Germany that spends 3.5% of its large economy on conventional weaponry is a very powerful force. And just one other figure here, Roland. If you add up European GDP, the members of NATO, for example, less America, it's something over $20 trillion. Russian GDP is about $2 trillion. We're about 10 times collectively richer in Europe than Russia is. So that makes our performance on defense look even more pathetic. So, we've got to get our act together. Just one last point on Meloni. It's all very well for the Italian Prime Minister to say we need to be much stronger and independent of America. Italy has spent less than 2% of GDP on defense for decades. They're one of the worst performers in terms of the European effort. They need to be amongst the biggest spenders in getting up to a reasonable level of defense. And also, a lot of their money, frankly, is spent very poorly. So Italy is one of the worst performers on defense.
There's a gap between the rhetoric and the reality, yeah. Just one more point on Europe. Do you really think that Trump and J.D. Vance and, the people around him, the people who put this together, they really think that Europe is in civilisational decline?
Everywhere will differ on just who is in civilisational decline. But I do think, certainly Donald Trump, what we were told during his first term about what he thought privately about Europe was very much in that vein. It was about too many years of uncontrolled migration, about too little spending on the stuff that mattered and too much on social policies and this kind of thing. And so I think Trump does feel that. I'm never quite sure what J.D. Vance thinks about anything because he changes his views so strikingly at times, but he's certainly picked up that particular theme and is running hard with it. So yeah, there is a lot of criticism of Europe. Now, I would slightly exclude the UK from this for two reasons. One, because our defence forces are a lot more effective than most of Europe's. And second, because I think Trump has some genuine affection for the UK because of his Scottish mother, because of his golf courses here, all this kind of thing, though he still thinks we're not the country we used to be. But generally, as a view of Europe, they think we are in decline. And one last point, a lot of American businessmen think that too. They look at how weak Europe is on new technologies, how low European economic growth is, how over-legislating and over-regulating they believe the European Union to be. So it's a common view amongst American businessmen. Not everyone, but a lot of American businessmen, senior businessmen, think that Europe's in serious decline. And if you look at Trump personally, the people he listens to most are not his staff, but his friends who are similar billionaires who made their billions in business. So there'll be a little sort of collective group of them there who will be talking about how much in decline Europe is and feeding each other, these stories about what's going on over here.
Coming up, Donald Trump's security strategy seems to rip up the transatlantic alliance. But what about the Pacific alliances? And what does it mean for the United States' relationship with China? Welcome back. You're listening to Battle Lines with me, Roland Oliphant, speaking to Kim Darroch, the former British ambassador in Washington. You began this conversation by saying, look, this is an extraordinary document and it kind of does a U-turn on 70 years of US foreign policy. Where does it leave the special relationship? I know there's always a big debate about whether the special relationship is just a kind of figment of Britain's imagination. Does it survive this? You're a British diplomat. You were in HMA Washington. You would have been writing advice to prime ministers about this. Is it time for Britain to really rethink its relationship with America?
I think America is too important to us. The defence and security relationship, foremost, which is absolutely essential for our own security. And then the economic relationship is hugely important as well, biggest recipient of UK exports. I'm not a great fan of the term special relationship, but we have to work...
Well, the diplomats use it when you're,
No, most of us didn't use it because it just sounds a bit needy. Every country thinks it has a special relationship with the United States. And it's a bit like the bridge metaphor where we would claim to be the bridge between the United States and Europe. And the Europeans would say, well, we have embassies in Washington. We know how to speak American. We have our own relationships. I don't know many of my colleagues who think it's a great thing to talk about all the time. But what is unquestionable is, first of all, the importance of the defense and security relationship, the interaction and relationship between our armed forces, our intelligence security agencies. And second, the economic relationship, because 20% of our exports go to the US. So we have to work constantly for the best possible relationship. And I think we do have...
But if the Americans have decided they're not interested in propping up the transatlantic alliance in the way they have done since they entered the war in 1941,
But that means we just have to get our act together on defence. That free lunch was always going to end sooner or later, and it is ending now. And Europe, if it gets to its act together and can also generate some economic growth, has more than enough resources to be an effective, globally recognised military and security power as well. We're a very, very rich part of the world still, so just need to get our act together on this. It's going to take a decade or two. We need to get there. And of course, meanwhile, there will be worrying degree of threat from a Russia led by Putin that's prepared to invade its neighbours. But even so, we can get there. But no, the US relationship, I think, is going to remain extremely important. And, we will see how much, because I don't believe all the national security establishment in America will agree with every word or even most of the words in this national security strategy. But we have to make ourselves relevant to America by doing better ourselves here in Europe.
So let's talk a little bit, if you have time, about you've spent a lot of time in Europe, I suppose, because we're both Europeans. If you view yourself as a European, I suppose that's a perennial question for British people.
I do.
The Monroe Doctrine, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, it kind of has pole position in its list of regions they talk about.
Yeah.
And they talk about, reassessing our military commitments elsewhere in the world to prioritize the Western Hemisphere, unapologetically saying we are going to assert American dominance. We're not going to allow any outside interlopers into the Americas, all of that. How much of that for you is a departure from where America has been in recent years?
This is very Donald Trump. But I do think, Roland, it's something that actually quite a lot of the American national security establishment on both sides of the aisle will agree with. They'll have been worried about Chinese influence in Latin America. They'll have been worried about the nature of some of the governments in Latin America, about the way Latin America is sending so much drugs and people and other things to the US. So I think that will touch a chord with a lot of people in the States. It's a kind of illustration of what I think is a Trumpian vision of the world, which is a power-based system rather than a rules-based system. And, everyone has the right to look after their own backyard, and Latin America will be seen as, Americans see that as their own backyard. Trump has always thought this about what's going on in Latin America, and that's not a huge surprise. But how it gets translated into policy and action is something we need to watch very closely. I mean, there is now a large American fleet, naval fleet, off Venezuela, as you know. If there is going to be what some people call kinetic action, if there are going to be missiles fired or bombs dropped in the near future anywhere in the world, I think on land targets in Venezuela is as likely as anywhere, frankly, given that, they've got all of this hardware, military hardware just off the coast now. And I think that's pattern. I mean, the pressure on Venezuela is a pattern that could be followed in relation to other Latin American countries as well. So this needs watching closely. The Europeans will be preoccupied with issues like the threat from Russia and what's going on in Ukraine rather than this. But this will need watching. And of course, some of the things that are going on already, a lot of people will say are breaches of international law. And again, what...
You mean the strikes on these alleged drug lords?
European governments, do they just ignore them or do they say anything about them? And of course, there are one or two European countries with very strong historic relations with Latin America. So there could be trouble down this path. But it's no surprise to me that Trump, in this national security strategy, has made this such a priority.
It is, and he talks about it in his inauguration speech, of course.
Yeah, he did. He said in his inauguration speech, there was a sentence saying that the drug barons of Latin America would be designated as terrorist organizations. And that, in American eyes, gives them the freedom to do what they may now do in terms of actually attacking, whether it's the sort of compounds of drug barons or the airstrips where they take off to supply America or any of this. It gives them a bit of freedom there. We wouldn't necessarily agree that that is now compatible with international law, but designating them as terrorists
changes things legally from the American point of view.
Yeah.
Do you think Canada, Greenland should? But when we think of the Monroe Doctrine, we usually look south. But there is the northern part of North America as well. Does the Canada-Greenland issue remain on the table in your eyes?
People say, some of the people around Trump or some of the close observers of him say that one of his great objectives in his second term is to quote, expand American territory, unquote, because only about 4 or 5 American presidents in history have done that. And he wants to be, I think it's the 6th. Well, I don't think Canada's going to become the 51st state. I don't think there's much you can do about Greenland. But if you just look at the map, you can see the strategic importance of Greenland in terms of the Arctic passages. And you can see why someone looking at it and thinking, well, Canada really, why is Canada a separate country up there? But I don't think it's going to happen.
It seemed to me when I was reading the strategy on Friday as it came out, frantically, so I could write a very, very quick analysis before I'd even been able to really think or dwell on it. The most conventional part of it seemed to be the bit about Asia Pacific and China. Yeah. The line on Taiwan it struck me that the line on Taiwan is exactly the kind of orthodox American defense and foreign policy posture that Europe is expecting and isn't getting and has been withdrawn from Europe. It says something like, and I'm quoting from memory, deterrence through military overmatch is key to maintaining peace, and our commitment to Taiwan is absolutely solid, and we remain committed to the long-standing American position that the status quo cannot be changed by force. That seemed about as strong and as explicit as you could get.
Yeah.
Why such a distinction? Why such kind of almost orthodoxy and detail as well in the China section compared to the European section?
I think, first of all, the bit on Taiwan could be a bit of a shift in terms of Donald Trump's own views. If you read John Bolton's book, In the Room, about his service for Trump as his national security advisor in the first term, they've since, of course, fallen out big time. But anyway, in his time as national security advisor, Bolton tells the story of trying to get Trump interested in Taiwan and to say something publicly about his support for Taiwan, and reports himself as completely failing by Trump saying, it's all about China, I'm not interested in Taiwan, in effect. And so the fact that language you quoted is in the NSS, for me is really quite striking and a bit of a surprise. And it suggests to me that Trump has been talked into taking more of an interest in Taiwan than he used to in his first term. And I think the key to this is he's being briefed on Taiwan's role as the supplier of 60% of the world's semiconductors and 80% of the very high-tech semiconductors. And until America produces more of its own, the strategic importance of that. So I think that's what's moved Trump on Taiwan, because he basically still sees China as essentially an economic challenge. There's a
lot about money in there. A lot of it is about trade balances and talking to allies.
The thing about China is how they built up a massive trade surplus with the US, about how they cheat on trade, they steal intellectual property, they have lots of hidden barriers to imports inside the Chinese system, how this is all fueling their ambition to be the world's biggest economic power by 2050. And Trump hates all of that. And so he sees China primarily, as I say, as an economic challenge. And in that sense, although his focus is much more economic than the US national security community, he's sort of in line with where the national security experts are on China as a challenge. And that's why this bit of the NSS looks much more conventional than quite a lot of the rest of it does, I think.
It struck me that maybe that section was basically written by Elbridge Colby. That's what it looked like to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there have been various pens at work in here, including, as I said, some little bits of J.D. Vance. But that's a very conventional view of the threat from China, except for its emphasis on economy rather than security.
On the Middle East and Africa, Africa's right down, it gets 3 paragraphs at the end of the document, and it basically says, we're looking for trade, and we're not going to lecture you about how you run your country.
One of the fascinating things about the whole thing is there is no lecturing of Russia and China and the Middle East, which of course,
they explicitly rule it out. They say we are done with that. We are not going to be judging you for how you run your countries.
Yeah, and the exemplar for that is Trump's recent meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, and they're shaking hands with him and saying, it's up to you how you run your kind of stuff. So there is this very sharp criticism of European politics and European governments and supposed suppression of democracy and free speech and whatever in Europe, and not a word of that kind about Russia, about China, about the Middle East, or about Africa. I mean, that's just very striking, you might say. But yeah, I mean, the signal to the Middle East and to Africa is we're not going to start lecturing you on human rights or whatever. We're interested in doing very good deals with you. We're interested in you, investing in the US, but I'm not going to lecture you on how you run your countries.
Would this change British foreign policy?
Two things. One, it may increase the pressure on the government to find ways of spending more on defence. And where's the money going to come from? It's got to come from some other budget. But it may sharpen the view here that we actually need to get on with this. That we can't pack it all into the back end of the next decade and just expect us to get up to 3.5% between 2030 and 2035. We've got to start doing more now. But the other thing I'm afraid is that, can I come back to the original point? It will worry people, I think, in the government, the tone and content of some of this. But such is the reality of the importance of the UK-US relationship that we will just have to keep doing our best to make the relationship as strong and effective as possible. And, I actually think, in amongst quite a difficult first year, actually, that's one of the success stories so far of this government. But they're walking a tightrope for the next 3.5 years.
What's the best way to do that then? I mean, is it this flattery of Donald Trump? Is he a man who is best managed simply by fawning and flattery and praise and Nobel Peace Prizes and you've brought us peace, aren't you wonderful? Or should people be more robust? I mean, we know he's very sensitive. Right. You know that personally from personal experience.
There's a friend of mine who is a long-standing and well-known US diplomat, Phil Gordon, who was Kamala Harris's national security advisor in the Biden administration, who has said there's too much flattery of Donald Trump. What works with Donald Trump is leverage, and the only people using leverage on him at the moment are the Chinese in their trade negotiations. And Phil is right about Trump being a very transactional guy who will recognize leverage and respond to it. But if you are a country of China's size, with China's importance on the global trade scene, China's cornering of the global market in rare earths and this kind of thing, then you've got leverage. If you're a medium-sized economy floating somewhere at the Atlantic, between Europe and America, you don't necessarily have that leverage. And so I think for us, flattery and staying very, very close as possible to this US administration is the only real route available to us. So, of course, it sticks in people's throat to see people sucking up quite as much to this administration, quite as much to Donald Trump. But you have to use what tools are available to you. And if we had more leverage, if we were a bigger economy, if we were part of the world's biggest single market, then we might have a bit more leverage. But as it is, we have to do our best with the tools available to us, and flattery is one of them. And there is some evidence, if you look at the trade deal that we've done with the Trump administration, that it can work.
Given that, I'm not sure if we've appointed a new HMA Washington yet, but in your view, who should it be, given in mind that, I hate to bring it up, but that you were basically forced out of the job because you upset Donald Trump?
I think that from what I hear, and I don't know who it's going to be, that there are some Foreign Office candidates if the Prime Minister wants to go back to having a career diplomat. And there are other names around, of which the one that I've seen in the media is Varun Chandra, who is business advisor who played quite a role in the negotiation of our trade deal with the US. Look, the Foreign Office names I hear about are all very good people. Nigel Casey, Christian Turner. Varun's a very, very smart guy. I know him too. And there may be other names out there. But, I think...
But is it a job for a diplomat, or is it a job for another? I mean, we sent Peter Mandelson because it was decided that it wasn't really a job for a diplomat. It was a job for a brilliant schmoozer.
I think it can be either. I don't think diplomacy is brain surgery. I think it helps obviously in terms of talking about the Middle East or about China, whatever, if you've had a career of immersed in these subjects. But equally, I mean, one of the most important things with America is the trade and business relationship. And, maybe a business works on that. So I'm not trying to duck the question, but I think all of the names that I'm seeing out there could do a very good job. We've got 500 people in that embassy and some very, very talented people. who can brief you and advise you on the stuff you don't know. So I think you can go either way.
That was Kim Darroch, former British diplomat and Her Majesty's ambassador to Washington during Donald Trump's first term in office. That's all for today's episode. We're back on Wednesday with our midweek Global Health Battle Lines edition, and on Friday with our usual end of the week geopolitical turmoil episode. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and Venetia Rainey. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others to find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin, and the executive producer is Louisa Wells.